I left my family 9 years ago with $17 a single backpack and a teaching scholarship they claimed I stole. My father stood before his entire congregation and called me mentally unstable. He erased me. But last week, my golden child sister found my name listed on an educational board. First she called, calling me sweetie. Then my mother called. Then my grandmother. Within 24 hours, I received 73 voicemails. Every single one repeated the exact same 3 words: "We forgive you." Before I share how I burned their perfect facade to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build an empire from the ashes of family betrayal. The view from my top-floor office offered a sweeping panorama of the Atlanta skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the bustling city below. I sat behind a custom mahogany desk. The surface was perfectly clear, except for my laptop and a sleek glass cup of water. My assistant David knocked twice before entering. He walked across the thick carpet with a careful expression on his face. He placed my personal cell phone on the center of my desk. The screen was lit up with endless notifications. He stated that my phone had not stopped ringing since yesterday afternoon. I dismissed him with a nod and looked at the screen. 73 missed calls. 73 voicemails. All from numbers I had memorized as a child and forced myself to forget as an adult. I leaned back in my leather chair and pressed play on the first message. The voice of my older sister Chanel filled the quiet office. Her tone was dripping with that familiar artificial sweetness she reserved for high society church functions. She said it had been so long since we talked. She said the family missed me terribly. She said they knew I had struggled in the past, but they were ready to move forward. Then came the phrase, "We forgive you." I deleted the message. I pressed play on the next one. This time it was my mother Brenda. Her voice trembled with practiced religious guilt. She said she had been praying for my soul every night for 9 years. She said the Lord had spoken to her heart and told her it was time to bring the lost sheep home. She said she was willing to overlook my past transgressions. She said families must stick together no matter how damaged one member might be. "We forgive you." I deleted her message as well. I skipped through dozens of similar messages until I reached the final one. It was my grandmother Geraldine. She was the absolute matriarch of the family. Her voice was sharp and commanding. She did not waste time with fake sweetness or religious posturing. She stated that blood was blood. She said the family had a reputation to uphold in the Atlanta community. She said they were willing to welcome me back into the fold and sweep my disgraceful exit under the rug. She ended her message with the exact same words, "We forgive you." I sat in the silence of my office. I did not feel anger. I felt a cold, calculating clarity. They were offering forgiveness to a woman who had done nothing wrong. 9 years ago, they threw me onto the street. $17. One backpack. 9 years. My father Calvin needed my teaching scholarship money to bribe his way into a political favor. When I refused to hand it over, he manufactured a lie. He stood at the pulpit of his megachurch and told thousands of people that I was suffering from severe mental illness. He said I had stolen church funds to fuel a manic episode. He destroyed my name to protect his political image. $17. One backpack. 9 years. And now they were offering me forgiveness. I turned my attention to the glowing screen of my laptop. I knew exactly why my phone was ringing today. Vanguard Horizon, the educational technology platform I founded and built from scratch, had just announced a massive new grant initiative for underprivileged schools. We were distributing $50 million to charter schools across the East Coast. My name was listed on the press release. They did not read the fine print. They saw my name alongside the board of directors and assumed I was just a mid-level grant reviewer or a diversity hire. They had no idea I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of the entire fund. They thought I was a stepping stone. I opened a secure financial database on my computer. I typed in the name of the charter school network managed by my white brother-in-law, Preston. Preston was Chanel's husband. He came from old Southern money. He loved playing the white savior for black children in Atlanta. He stood on stages and talked about uplifting the community while secretly lining his own pockets. I pulled up the school's public tax records and matched them against the internal banking flows my team had legally acquired during our grant vetting process. The numbers were an absolute disaster. Preston was bleeding the charter school dry. He was embezzling lunch program funds and state educational subsidies to cover massive losses in his personal shell companies. The school was facing a catastrophic deficit. They were $2 million in the hole. An independent state audit was scheduled for next month. If Preston did not find $2 million immediately, he would go to federal prison. The perfect white savior would be exposed as a common thief. I opened another file. This one belonged to my father. Calvin was currently running a highly publicized campaign for city council. He built his entire platform on family values and fiscal responsibility. I traced the campaign contributions. Large sums of money were moving from Preston's charter school vendors directly into Calvin's political action committee. My father was using stolen lunch money to buy political power. If Preston fell, my father would fall with him. The entire family facade would shatter into a million pieces. That was why the phone was ringing. That was why I was suddenly receiving 73 voicemails offering fake grace. They needed an emergency grant from Vanguard Horizon to cover the stolen $2 million. They thought they could summon the disgraced daughter back to the dinner table, feed her a few scraps of false affection, and manipulate her into pushing their grant application through the system. They thought I was desperate for their love. They thought I was still the broken 21-year-old girl standing on the curb with a backpack. I closed my laptop. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out over the city of Atlanta. This city belonged to me now. I had bled for every brick of my empire. I survived sleeping in bus stations. I survived working 4 jobs to fund my first software prototype. I survived the rumors and the whispers of the church ladies who crossed the street when they saw me. $17. 1 backpack. 9 years. My phone buzzed again. A text message from Chanel. It was an invitation to a late dinner at my parents' mansion in Buckhead. She wrote that they set a place for me at the table. She wrote that it was time to let go of the past and act like a real family. She added a smiley face emoji at the end. The sheer audacity of her text was almost impressive. I walked over to my private wall safe. I unlocked the heavy steel door and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. Inside the folder was not a grant approval form. It was a fully executed commercial real estate acquisition contract and an order for a federal audit. I slipped the folder under my arm. I did not pack a bottle of wine. I did not buy a bouquet of flowers. I walked out of my office and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. The drive to Buckhead took 40 minutes. The streets transitioned from the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown to the sprawling tree-lined avenues of the wealthy suburbs. I drove my black sports car through the familiar iron gates of my parents' neighborhood. The houses here were monuments to status. Huge brick facades with perfectly manicured lawns and circular driveways. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. The house looked exactly the same imposing columns, the same pristine white trim, the same heavy oak double doors that had been slammed in my face 9 years ago. I parked my car behind Chanel's brand new luxury SUV. I stepped out into the cool evening air. I smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored suit. I held the black leather folder tightly against my side. I walked up the stone steps. Every step felt like a heavy drumbeat echoing in my chest. $17. 1 backpack. 9 years. I reached the landing. I did not knock. I pressed the doorbell and waited for the illusion to begin. The heavy oak door swung open almost immediately. Preston stood in the doorway. He wore an expensive cashmere sweater and a condescending smile. He held a glass of dark bourbon in his hand. He looked me up and down. His blue eyes held that familiar, arrogant glint. He looked at me, not as an equal, but as a subordinate who had finally come crawling back to beg for scraps. His smile widened into a superior smirk. He stepped aside and gestured into the grand foyer. He said it was about time I showed up to pay my respects. He told me to wipe my shoes before stepping on the marble. I looked directly into his eyes. I did not smile. I stepped across the threshold and let the games begin. The marble floor was cold beneath my shoes as I walked past Preston into the grand foyer. The air smelled of roasted garlic and heavy, expensive perfume. I recognized the scent immediately. It was the same designer fragrance Chanel used to drown out the smell of the cheap apartments we grew up in before my father became a megachurch pastor. Preston closed the heavy oak door behind me. The sound echoed through the massive house. He walked past me with his glass of bourbon. He did not offer to take my coat. He simply pointed his glass toward the formal dining room down the hall. He told me the family was waiting and that I should not keep them in suspense. I followed him into the dining room. The space was a monument to their artificial wealth. A massive crystal chandelier hung over a long mahogany table. Silver platters of catered food sat untouched. My father Calvin sat at the head of the table wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a teacher makes in a month. My mother Brenda sat to his right, clutching a linen napkin with her manicured hands. Chanel sat to his left, wearing a silk dress and a diamond necklace that I knew was paid for by stolen school funds. Preston took the seat next to Chanel. He owned the room. He owned them. Preston did not offer me a seat at the main section of the table. He pointed his finger toward a small wooden chair pushed into the far corner near the kitchen door. It was the kind of chair you give to a misbehaving child or an unwanted guest. He told me to sit there. He said it was the best they could do on such short notice. I walked over to the corner and sat down. I placed the black leather folder on my lap. I crossed my legs and looked at the four of them. They looked back at me with a mixture of pity and arrogant satisfaction. Preston took a slow sip of his bourbon. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He began his lecture. He said I looked tired and worn out from the corporate grind. He said working in the lower levels of a company like Vanguard Horizon must be exhausting for someone with my background. He smiled when he said the word background. He meant my past. He meant the lies my father had told about me. Preston then shifted the conversation to himself. He loved nothing more than hearing his own voice. He talked about his charter school network. He talked about the heavy burden of being a wealthy white man trying to uplift a broken black community in Atlanta. He said it was a thankless job. He said he spent every waking hour trying to bring education and class to people who did not know how to help themselves. He looked at my father and said he had done everything in his power to elevate this family. He claimed he brought sophistication to their lives. He reminded them of the country club memberships he secured for them. He reminded them of the political doors he opened for my father. He spoke as if he were a god who had reached down from the heavens to pull them out of the dirt. My parents nodded along. They smiled and agreed with every condescending word that fell from his mouth. They sold their pride for a mansion in Buckhead. Chanel chimed in next. She tossed her long hair over her shoulder and sighed dramatically. She said the cost of maintaining their lifestyle was getting out of hand. She complained about the price of private tennis lessons for her imaginary future children. She complained about the rising costs of hosting charity galas. She reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila folder. She tossed it across the polished mahogany wood. It slid across the table and stopped near the edge right in front of my corner chair. I looked down at the folder. It was thick with forged documents and fake financial projections. Chanel told me it was a grant application for Preston's charter school network. She said it was for $2 million. She crossed her arms and stared at me with cold entitlement. She told me she knew I worked in the grant review department at Vanguard Horizon. She said the family had done some digging and found my name in the staff directory. She ordered me to take the folder back to my office on Monday morning. She told me to use whatever small amount of employee access I had to push the application to the top of the pile. She said I needed to stamp it approved before the state auditors arrived next month. She spoke to me as if I were a servant. She said it was the absolute least I could do after the shame I brought upon their name. I did not touch the folder. I kept my hands resting on my own black leather portfolio. I looked at Chanel. I looked at Preston. I looked at my mother who was staring at her plate. Finally, I looked at my father. Calvin picked up a silver spoon. He tapped it gently against his crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the heavy air in the dining room. He stood up slowly. He smoothed the front of his expensive suit jacket. He looked down at me from the head of the table. He put on his best preaching voice, the same voice he used to manipulate thousands of desperate people every Sunday morning. He said we needed to have an honest conversation about debt and redemption. He told me to look at the luxurious room around me. He told me to look at the food on the table. He reminded me of where I came from. He took a deep breath and brought up the day they threw me out. He said he still remembered the exact amount of money I had in my pocket. $17. He said he remembered the cheap canvas backpack I carried. He recounted the events of 9 years ago with a sick sense of pride. He said it was the hardest day of his life, but he did what a strong leader must do. He paced back and forth behind his chair. He talked about standing before his entire congregation the following Sunday. He described the tears he forced himself to cry. He described how his voice shook when he told the church that his daughter had lost her mind. He recounted the lie word for word. He told them I was mentally unstable. He told them I had succumbed to dark urges and stolen the parish scholarship funds to fuel a manic breakdown. He said the congregation wept for him. He said they donated even more money to comfort him in his time of sorrow. Calvin looked me dead in the eye and said he had to sacrifice my reputation to save the family. He needed that scholarship money to secure a political alliance with Preston's family. He said it was a necessary casualty for the greater good. He told me I was a collateral damage in the building of a dynasty. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily on the table. He pointed his finger at me. He said I owed them my life. He said the $2 million grant application sitting on the table was my chance to buy back my soul. He told me to approve the grant to save Preston from the auditors and to secure his city council campaign. He said if I did this one simple task, they would let me sit at the main table next Thanksgiving. The room was dead silent. Preston was smirking. Chanel was tapping her manicured nails on the wood. Brenda was wiping away a fake tear. Calvin was waiting for my absolute submission. They all thought they had me cornered. They thought the broken girl from 9 years ago was still desperate for their validation. I slowly stood up from the small wooden chair in the corner. I picked up the thick manila folder containing the $2 million grant application. I walked over to the center of the dining room. I stood directly in front of Preston and Chanel. I looked down at the documents. The pages were filled with lies about educational programs and community outreach. The pages represented stolen futures and broken promises to children who actually needed the money. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers wrapped around the cool metal of a gold butane lighter. I pulled it out. I flicked the lid open. I pressed my thumb down. A sharp blue flame erupted in the quiet room. I held the manila folder over the massive floral centerpiece in the middle of the table. I brought the blue flame to the bottom corner of the thick paper stack. The dry paper caught fire instantly. The bright orange flames crawled up the sides of the application. The smell of burning paper and melting plastic filled the dining room. Preston dropped his glass of bourbon. It shattered on the marble floor. Chanel screamed and pushed her chair back. Calvin froze in pure shock. Brenda gasped and covered her mouth. They watched in horror as the $2 million lifeline turned to black ash in my hands. The flames licked dangerously close to my fingers. I did not flinch. I let the burning papers drop onto the silver platter in the center of the table. The ashes scattered across the expensive catered food. I looked directly at Preston. The arrogant smirk had completely vanished from his pale face. His eyes were wide with panic. I spoke clearly and calmly. I told him I was not a low-level clerk. I told him I was not a grant reviewer desperate to keep a corporate job. I told him I built Vanguard Horizon with my own 2 hands. I told him I owned every single server, every single contract, and every single dollar in that $50 million fund. I leaned across the table. I stared into his terrified blue eyes. I told him my signature was worth billions of dollars. I told him my ink could change the landscape of education across the entire country. I told him I would never use a single drop of that ink to save a white embezzler who was stealing lunch money from black students to pay for his wife's vanity. I called him exactly what he was, a thief masking his greed behind a savior complex. The flames continued to crackle on the silver platter, casting long dancing shadows across their horrified faces. The ashes from the $2 million grant application continued to smolder on the silver platter. The silence in the dining room was absolute and heavy. Then Chanel broke the quiet. The perfect golden child could not comprehend the reality playing out in front of her eyes. Her entire life was funded by the money Preston stole from his students. Her designer wardrobe and her luxury vehicles were paid for by the charter school network. Seeing that application burn meant seeing her credit cards decline. She snapped completely. She pushed her heavy wooden chair back so hard it crashed to the polished marble floor. She marched around the mahogany table with her hands curled into tight fists. Her face was contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. She raised her right hand high in the air to slap me across the face. She wanted to put the disgraced sister back in her proper place. She expected me to cower just like I did when we were vulnerable teenagers living under this roof. I did not cower. I watched her hand descend in slow motion. I raised my left arm and blocked her strike before it even came close to my cheek. I grabbed her delicate wrist with my right hand. I twisted her arm backward and forced her down toward the table. I did not apply enough pressure to break the bone, but I applied enough to make her understand the power dynamic had permanently shifted. Chanel let out a loud gasp of pain. Her knees hit the cold marble floor. She immediately began to sob loudly. She looked up at Preston and our parents with tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. She played the victim flawlessly. She wailed that I was attacking her in her own home. She acted as though she had not just tried to strike me across the face. She put on a masterful performance of pain and suffering. My mother, Brenda, sprang into action. She abandoned her linen napkin and rushed over to Chanel. She knelt on the floor and wrapped her arms around her golden child. She glared up at me with eyes full of venom and hatred. She told me to release her daughter immediately. I let go of Chanel's wrist and took a calm step back. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored suit jacket. Brenda helped Chanel to her feet and smoothed the wrinkles from her silk dress. The performance of the protective mother was sickening to witness. She had never once rushed to comfort me when I was a child. She saved all her maternal instincts for the daughter who made her look good at country club luncheons and church gatherings. Brenda pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. She told me I was a complete disgrace to the family name. She said I had returned to their beautiful home only to cause violence and destruction. She completely ignored the fact that Preston was embezzling millions of dollars from poor children. She ignored the fact that Chanel had thrown the first punch. In Brenda's world, the only sin was making the family look bad in front of others. She said she should have known better than to invite the black sheep back to the dinner table. She said my soul was corrupted, and my heart was full of bitter jealousy. She claimed I was just angry because Chanel had a wealthy husband and a beautiful life while I had nothing but a miserable corporate job. She still refused to believe I owned Vanguard Horizon. Her mind simply could not process the idea that the daughter she discarded had become a billionaire. Brenda stood tall and crossed her arms over her chest. She decided it was time to put me back in my place using her absolute favorite weapon. She brought up the events from 9 years ago. She reminded me of the medical records my father Calvin had manufactured to ruin my life. He had paid a corrupt church counselor a massive sum of money to write a fabricated psychological evaluation about me. The fake evaluations stated I suffered from severe manic episodes and dangerous delusions of grandeur. It was the exact document Calvin used to justify kicking me out onto the street and stealing my scholarship money. Brenda smiled a cold, calculating smile. She told me she still had those original documents locked in a secure safety deposit box at her downtown bank. She said corporate America was very strict about the mental health and criminal backgrounds of its employees. She reasoned that a massive educational technology company like Vanguard Horizon would never employ someone with a documented history of severe instability and theft. She threatened to scan every single page of that fabricated medical file. She threatened to send it directly to the Human Resources Department at my company. She said she would attach a formal letter detailing how I had physically assaulted my sister and burned company property at a family dinner. She promised to make sure I was fired and blacklisted from the industry before Monday morning. She said she would reduce me back to the broken girl with $17 and a canvas backpack. She wanted to see me begging on the street again. She wanted me to crawl back to the church and ask for their mercy. Preston liked the sound of that plan. The color slowly returned to his pale face. He straightened his expensive cashmere sweater and walked over to stand beside my mother. He pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket. He said there was no need to wait until Monday morning to begin my ruin. He said Vanguard Horizon had a 24-hour corporate ethics hotline specifically for reporting extreme misconduct. He proudly stated that he knew this detail because he had spent the last week researching the company for his grant application. He looked at me with that familiar arrogant smirk. He truly thought he held my entire career and my future in the palm of his hand. He navigated to the corporate website on his glowing phone screen. He found the ethics hotline number and dialed it. He tapped the speakerphone button so the entire dining room could hear my destruction unfold in real time. He set the phone down on the polished mahogany table right next to the silver platter of burnt ashes. The line began to ring loudly. The sound echoed through the large formal room. Chanel stopped fake crying and wiped her eyes. A cruel smile spread across her face as she watched my impending doom. Calvin finally sat down in his large chair at the head of the table. He folded his hands together and watched me intently. He expected me to panic. He expected me to drop to my knees and beg them to hang up the phone. He expected me to promise to approve their $2 million grant in exchange for their silence. I did not panic. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still and watched the phone ring. I knew exactly where that hotline routed after regular business hours. I had designed the security protocol myself. Any high-level ethical complaint concerning senior executives bypassed standard human resources entirely. It went directly to a private third-party security firm located in a secure building downtown. If the complaint involved the chairman of the board, it triggered an immediate direct line connection to the chairman to verify the threat level. The ringing on Preston's phone stopped. An automated voice thanked the caller for contacting the Vanguard Horizon Corporate Ethics and Compliance Hotline. The automated voice stated that the call might be recorded for quality and security purposes. Preston leaned over the table and spoke clearly into the microphone. He stated his full name and his position as the director of the local charter school network. He said he was calling to report a severe ethical violation and unhinged behavior by a Vanguard Horizon employee named Roxanne. He claimed I was currently at his residence destroying property and making delusional claims about owning the company. He said he had medical records proving I was mentally unfit for corporate employment and a danger to society. He requested to speak with a senior human resources director immediately to process my termination. He stood up straight and crossed his arms. He looked at me as if he had just won a major war. He was so proud of his ability to manipulate the system to his advantage. He was so confident in his white savior status and his old money heritage. The automated voice on the speakerphone requested him to hold while the call was routed to the appropriate executive security division based on the severity of the allegations. Hold music began to play softly from the small speaker on the table. The hold music played for exactly 15 seconds. Then the silence in the dining room was broken by a completely different sound. It was a sharp professional ringtone coming from the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I reached inside and pulled out my personal secure mobile device. The screen illuminated the dim room. The caller identification displayed the name of my private corporate security director. I held the phone up high so they could all see the glowing screen. I did not break eye contact with Preston for a single second. I swiped the screen to answer the call and pressed the speakerphone button on my device. The soft music on Preston's phone abruptly stopped. The connection clicked over. The heavy, authoritative voice of my security chief filled the dining room, coming simultaneously from both the phone on the mahogany table and the phone in my hand. The security chief spoke with absolute formal respect. He addressed me as Madam Chairman. He reported that the automated system had just flagged a Tier 1 defamatory attack against my name and my position within the company. He stated that an individual claiming to be a school director was currently on the line attempting to file a fraudulent termination request against the owner of the corporation. He asked for my direct authorization to trace the call and dispatch the federal legal team to handle the harassment and the attempted extortion. I looked around the room. The transition was beautiful and deeply satisfying to witness. The smug satisfaction drained from Preston's face in an absolute instant. The color completely washed out of his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Chanel gasped loudly and covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes darted wildly between the phone on the table and the phone in my hand. Brenda stumbled backward and grabbed the back of a dining chair to steady herself as her knees gave out. Calvin sat frozen at the head of the table. His jaw hung slightly unhinged. The reality of my words had finally penetrated their thick, arrogant skulls. They realized I was not delusional. They realized the ashes on the silver platter were real. They realized they had just dialed a corporate hotline to report the billionaire owner of the company directly to herself. I spoke into my phone. My voice was cold and steady. I told my security chief to hold the line open. I told him the perpetrator was standing right in front of me in the dining room. I looked directly at Preston. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to explain to my private security team why he was making false reports against the sole proprietor of Vanguard Horizon before I authorized a massive lawsuit that would completely liquidate his entire charter school network. The silence that followed was the absolute sweetest sound I had heard in 9 long years. The dial tone echoed in the dining room before the line went completely dead. I placed my secure mobile device back into my inner pocket. I watched the men and women at the table struggle to comprehend their new reality. The silence stretched on for a full minute. The heavy air in the room felt suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit working to cool the mansion. The survival instincts of a privileged man finally kicked in. Preston stood up straight. He brushed imaginary dust from the sleeves of his expensive cashmere sweater. He walked over to the mahogany sideboard and poured himself a fresh glass of bourbon. His hands were shaking slightly against the crystal decanter, but he forced his breathing to slow down. He turned to face me. He had decided to abandon his role as the benevolent savior of the community. He was retreating to the fortress he knew best. He was hiding behind the law and his bloodline. Preston took a slow sip of his amber drink. He began to speak in a low and menacing register. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game. He said I might have stumbled into some new money, but I had absolutely no idea how the real world operated. He reminded me that his family had been building wealth and influence in the state of Georgia for 5 generations. He said his grandfather helped write the commercial zoning laws of the city. He stated his uncle played golf every single weekend with the federal judges who oversaw corporate litigation. He paced back and forth behind his wooden chair. The ice in his glass clinked softly. He told me that new money was fragile and easily broken. He said the legal system was meticulously designed by his ancestors to protect established families like his and to strip resources away from people like me. He claimed my corporate structure at Vanguard Horizon was full of vulnerabilities that his elite team of attorneys could exploit within hours. He said he could file a dozen injunctions by Monday afternoon. He threatened to freeze my personal and business assets indefinitely. He painted a bleak picture of endless court battles. He said he would tie my company up in aggressive litigation until I was bankrupt and begging for mercy on the courthouse steps. He told me the courts would never side with a black woman who had a documented history of severe mental instability. He said a judge would look at my father's old church records and declare me unfit to manage a $50 million fund. He smiled as he spoke. He found comfort in the systemic inequality he planned to weaponize against me. He leaned his weight against the edge of the dining table. He offered what he called a generous settlement. He said he was willing to make all of my impending legal troubles disappear. He demanded that I sign over a controlling interest of my company to my father. He claimed Calvin was the only person in this room who possessed the moral authority and public trust to manage such a vast financial empire. He said it was my duty to compensate the family for the profound disrespect I had shown them tonight. He told me it was the only way to protect the church and preserve the family image before the upcoming city council election. He spun his extortion as a noble act of family preservation. Chanel stopped her theatrical crying and nodded in agreement. She patted her hair back into place. The familiar greed returned to her eyes. She liked the idea of her father controlling my wealth. My mother Brenda clasped her hands together in silent prayer, as if Preston had just offered a holy revelation. My father Calvin sat up straighter in his chair at the head of the table. His eyes widened at the thought of holding the reins to a $50 million educational fund. He adjusted his silk tie. They all looked at me. They were waiting for me to surrender to the threat of white institutional power. They fully expected me to cave under the pressure of Preston's legal intimidation. I did not blink. I kept my posture perfectly rigid. I looked at Preston and told him his law degree was as worthless as his empty threats. I turned my attention away from him and focused entirely on my father. I told Calvin it was time to talk about the scholarship money. I brought up the event from 9 years ago. I told them I knew exactly where those funds went. I detailed the comprehensive financial audit my security team had conducted over the past 6 months. I explained that the money did not go toward church roof repairs. It did not go toward the youth ministry or the community food drive. I stated clearly that Calvin wired every single cent of my teaching scholarship directly into a private offshore account owned by Preston's father. I watched Calvin's face turn the color of wet ash. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. I explained the true nature of that ancient financial transaction. I told the room that Calvin sold his own daughter to buy Chanel a seat at the table. He paid a massive bribe to Preston's family to ensure they would accept a black girl from a newly rich church family into their exclusive social circle. I stated that Chanel's entire marriage was a purchased arrangement. I told Chanel her husband did not marry her for love. I told her he married her because her father paid his family an exorbitant fee to overlook her background. I kept my voice steady and unyielding. I explained that Calvin destroyed my reputation and threw me onto the street because he needed a convenient scapegoat to cover up the missing funds. He stood at the pulpit and cried fake tears about my mental health simply to mask the fact that he was buying a wealthy white husband for his golden child. He sacrificed my future to fund Chanel's illusion of high society. He let the congregation believe I was a thief so he could play the role of the tragic grieving father. He built his entire political career on the sympathy he garnered from ruining my life. Chanel let out a strangled gasp. She looked at Preston with wide, terrified eyes. She begged him to tell her it was a lie. Preston did not deny it. He simply tightened his grip on his crystal glass and looked away from her. The realization washed over Chanel like ice water. Her perfect life was a transaction. Her superior attitude was funded by my stolen scholarship. She sank down into her chair and buried her face in her hands. Brenda began to hyperventilate. She grasped her chest and stared at Calvin. She knew he was corrupt, but she never knew the exact details of the bribe. Calvin remained silent. He had absolutely no defense against the documented truth. Preston tried to regain control of the room. He set his bourbon glass down hard on the table. He raised his voice and told me past financial transfers were completely irrelevant. He said his current charter school empire was untouchable. He bragged about the massive brick building downtown. He said his educational legacy was protected by state law and heavily backed by local politicians. He claimed he was untouchable regardless of how his marriage began. He told me I could never take down a man who provided education to hundreds of children. He wore his savior mask tightly over his face. I reached into my black leather folder. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy watermark paper. It was a commercial property deed, accompanied by a certified bank statement. I slid the documents across the polished mahogany table. The heavy paper stopped right in front of Preston. I told him to look closely at the signature on the deed. I told him I purchased the land beneath his flagship charter school 12 months ago through an anonymous holding company. I informed him that I was his landlord. I watched his eyes scan the document. His breathing stopped completely. I stated that his corporate lease was in severe default. I told him he was 6 months behind on rent. I explained that he had been illegally using the state subsidy money to pay off his personal gambling debts instead of paying his lease. I leaned forward and rested my hands on the table. I delivered the final blow. I stated that the formal eviction notice had already been filed with the city court. I told him his precious school doors would be padlocked by the sheriff on Monday morning. I said his entire legacy was built on my property and I was tearing it down. I stood there and let the reality of the documents sink into his mind. I told Preston that his grandfather's zoning laws and his uncle's golf buddies could not save him from a simple breach of contract. I explained that commercial real estate law was absolute. I told him the state did not care about his old money heritage when a tenant failed to pay rent for half a year. I walked slowly around the edge of the dining table. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. I approached the chair where he stood frozen. I told him that I had spent the last 5 years quietly acquiring the commercial debt of every single shell company he managed. I stated that I owned the paper on his cars, his vacation home, and the building where he housed his charter school. Preston began to sweat. Small beads of moisture formed on his forehead. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He picked up his bourbon glass with trembling fingers and swallowed the rest of the liquor in one gulp. He told me I could not do this to the children. He tried to use the students as human shields. He said hundreds of innocent kids would have nowhere to go on Monday morning if I locked the doors. He claimed I was hurting the very community I pretended to care about. He said I was a monster for disrupting their education over a personal vendetta. I stopped walking and stood directly across from him. I told him his fake concern for black children was nauseating. I informed him that Vanguard Horizon had already purchased a larger, safer, and fully modernized facility 3 blocks away from his crumbling building. I stated that every single student enrolled in his fraudulent charter school had already been guaranteed a spot in my new academy. I told him the parents had been notified by mail this afternoon. I explained that they were given full scholarships and brand new equipment. I said the children were entirely safe from his incompetence. I told him the only person who would be left out in the cold on Monday morning was him. I turned my attention back to Calvin. The mighty pastor looked like a deflated balloon. His political dreams were tied directly to Preston's success. I told Calvin that the media would have a field day with the eviction. I said the local news stations were already holding copies of Preston's default notices. I told my father that the moment the sheriff padlocked the school, the journalists would start asking questions about the missing lunch funds. I explained that investigative reporters would follow the money trail right back to his city council campaign. I stated that his political action committee would be audited by the state election board before the end of the week. Calvin tried to stand up, but his legs refused to support his weight. He slumped back into his chair. He looked at me with pleading eyes. He told me we could fix this together. He said we could combine my wealth with his influence and rule the city. He offered to publicly apologize to me in front of the congregation. He promised to tell the church that my mental health had miraculously recovered through the grace of prayer. He said he would restore my good name if I just shredded the eviction notice and approved the $2 million grant. He was bargaining with stolen currency. He still believed his words had value. I looked at him with absolute disgust. I told him his congregation was a flock of blind sheep following a wolf. I said his public apology meant nothing to a woman who owned the banks that held his mortgages. I reminded him of the $17 he gave me. I told him I stretched those $17 to buy food for a week while I slept on a park bench. I told him I washed my only shirt in public restrooms while he wore tailored suits bought with my stolen scholarship. I stated that 9 years of suffering could not be erased by a fake apology on a Sunday morning. Brenda finally found her voice. She stood up and pointed a manicured finger at me. She told me I was a cruel and heartless child. She said God would punish me for disrespecting my parents and destroying my sister's marriage. She claimed I was possessed by an evil spirit. She said no righteous woman would ever harbor this much vengeance in her heart. She told me to leave her house and never return. She said they did not need my money or my presents. I looked at my mother and smiled a cold, hollow smile. I told her to look closely at the bank statements I had provided. I advised her to read the name of the holding company that owned the mortgage on the very mansion we were standing in. I watched her eyes dart down to the papers on the table. I stated that Calvin had taken out a massive second mortgage to fund his political campaign. I told her he had defaulted on those payments 3 months ago. I explained that Vanguard Horizon's real estate division had purchased the bad debt from their bank. I told Brenda that I owned the roof over her head. I stated that she was standing in my house. The air left the room. Brenda collapsed into her chair. Chanel continued to sob quietly into her hands. Preston stared blankly at the wall. Calvin hung his head in absolute defeat. The illusion of their superiority had been systematically dismantled and crushed under the weight of undeniable financial proof. They had tried to use the law and their social status to intimidate me. They failed to realize I had simply bought the ground they stood on. I walked back to my corner chair and picked up my black leather folder. I placed the documents neatly inside. I told Preston his eviction was scheduled for 8 in the morning. I told Calvin his political career was officially dead. I told Chanel her husband was a fraud. I told Brenda she had 30 days to vacate my property. I turned toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. I did not wait for their response. I had delivered exactly what I came to deliver. The absolute dismantling of their savior mask was complete. Then the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung wide open. The sudden noise pulled every eye away from the burnt ashes on the silver platter. A slow, rhythmic tapping sound echoed down the long marble hallway. Tap, tap, tap. It was a sound that had commanded absolute obedience in our family for decades. My grandmother Geraldine stepped into the room. She was 78 years old, but she held herself like an ancient queen. She leaned on a polished mahogany cane with a heavy silver handle. She wore an immaculate dark purple suit and pearls that gleamed under the crystal chandelier. She did not rush. She did not show an ounce of panic. She surveyed the scene with cold, calculating eyes. She looked at the shattered glass from Preston's dropped bourbon. She looked at the charred remains of the grant application on the silver platter. She looked at the terrified faces of her children and grandchildren. Finally, her sharp, dark eyes locked onto mine. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Calvin sat up slightly straighter in his chair. Brenda wiped her face and tried to compose her posture. Chanel immediately stifled her loud sobs. They all deferred to the absolute matriarch of the family. Geraldine was the architect of this dysfunctional dynasty. Geraldine walked slowly to the head of the table. She placed her wrinkled hand on Calvin's shoulder. It was a deliberate gesture of support for the male heir. She did not yell. She did not scream like my mother had. Her voice was smooth and dangerously quiet. It was the exact voice she used to control the church congregation behind the scenes. She told me I had grown into a very dramatic woman. She said it was a profound shame that all my financial success had not bought me an ounce of grace or humility. I watched her carefully. I knew her tactics. She was a master of emotional warfare. She began her sermon. She spoke about the sacred nature of bloodlines. She said the world outside this house was eager to tear successful families apart. She told me that a divided house could never stand against the pressures of society. Her words sounded like a soothing lullaby, but they were laced with pure venom. She said she was proud of the little technology company I had managed to scrape together. She used the word little intentionally to minimize an empire worth billions. She told me that independent wealth was a very heavy burden for a woman to carry alone without her family. She claimed I was clearly acting out of unresolved childhood pain. She used my past trauma as a weapon disguised as deep sympathy. She said the family was ready to forgive my violent outburst. She offered me the ultimate prize of returning to the fold. Geraldine stepped away from Calvin and moved closer to me. The scent of her heavy floral perfume masked the smell of the burnt paper. She tapped her cane on the marble floor to emphasize her next words. She said blood must always protect blood. She told me the political image of this family was far more important than my personal pride. She pointed her silver-handled cane at my father. She said Calvin was on the verge of becoming a powerful city councilman. She pointed her cane at Preston. She said Preston was the key to expanding our influence into wealthy neighborhoods we could never access on our own. She stopped in front of me and demanded that I drop my hostility immediately. She told me to step forward and physically kneel on the marble floor. She commanded me to kneel before Calvin and apologize for disrespecting his household. She commanded me to kneel before Preston and apologize for threatening his charitable work. She said I needed to show absolute submission to the leaders of this family. She told me to transfer the corporate shares to my father to prove my loyalty. She told me to fund the charter school to prove my worth. She demanded total surrender. I stared down at her in pure disbelief. The sheer audacity of her demand was staggering. She wanted the billionaire victim to kneel before her abusers to protect their public image. I did not move. I did not lower my gaze. I did not bend my knee. I told Geraldine that her dynasty was built on theft and manipulation. I told her I would never bow to a corrupt pastor and a common embezzler. Geraldine's pleasant mask slipped completely. Her dark eyes turned as hard as flint. She realized emotional manipulation was not working on me. She realized the broken girl she used to control was entirely gone. She leaned heavily on her cane and switched to open warfare. She lowered her voice to a dangerous hiss. She told me I was vastly underestimating her reach in this city. She reminded me that she sat on the board of every major religious and charitable organization in the state of Georgia. She said she controlled the church elders. She controlled the community leaders. She controlled the local politicians who relied on her congregation for votes. She threatened to launch a massive coordinated boycott against Vanguard Horizon. She promised to use every single pulpit in the city to preach against my company. She said she would paint me as a ruthless corporate predator who was destroying local charter schools and hurting innocent, underprivileged children. She said she would twist the narrative so perfectly that the public would demand my resignation. She told me she could turn my own community against me in a matter of days. She said she would organize protests outside my corporate headquarters. She said she would make my name toxic in the educational technology sector. She gave me a strict ultimatum. She said I had exactly 24 hours to hand over the required assets to Calvin and fully fund Preston's school. She warned that if I did not comply by tomorrow evening, I would face complete social and professional ruin. She said she would see me utterly erased from this city. The dining room fell silent once again. My parents and my sister watched me eagerly from their seats. They truly believed Geraldine had trapped me. They thought the threat of a massive public scandal would finally break my spirit. They thought I was still terrified of being rejected by the community. They thought I was afraid of the dark. I stood tall. My spine was straight and my shoulders were pulled back. I looked down at the elderly woman who had orchestrated my misery for decades. I did not kneel. I did not raise my voice. I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Geraldine grip her silver cane tighter. I told her I heard her demands perfectly. I buttoned my suit jacket and picked up my black leather portfolio from the small wooden chair. I looked around the large dining room at the 5 people who had tried to destroy me. I told them I would not be transferring any assets or signing any documents tonight. However, I noted that the church was hosting its annual High Society fundraising gala this coming Saturday night. It was the biggest social event of the entire year for their political allies and their wealthy donors. I looked directly into Geraldine's dark eyes. I told her I would attend the gala on Saturday evening. I promised to bring the exact gift this family deserved. I told them they would receive their answer in front of the entire congregation. I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal dining room. I walked down the long marble hallway and pushed the heavy oak front door open. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I could hear the collective sigh of relief echoing from the dining room behind me. They actually thought my promise of a gift meant I was going to deliver the grant money. They assumed I had surrendered to the matriarch. They assumed I was afraid of her boycott. They assumed wrong. They had absolutely no idea I was bringing a reckoning that would burn their entire empire to the ground. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, leaving the mansion in silence. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere immediately shifted from stunned terror to arrogant delusion. My grandmother Geraldine stood at the head of the table, gripping her silver-handled cane. She looked at her trembling family and let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. She told them to wipe their faces and stop acting like frightened children. She said my parting words were a clear admission of defeat. She twisted my promise of a gift into a desperate plea for their acceptance. Geraldine assured Calvin and Preston that the threat of losing my corporate empire and facing a church-led boycott had completely broken my resolve. She said the prodigal daughter had finally realized she could not survive in this world without the protection of her bloodline. Calvin let out a long breath and reached for his crystal water glass. The color slowly returned to his cheeks. He smoothed his expensive silk tie and nodded in agreement with his mother. He told his wife and Chanel that Geraldine was right. He said my hostility was just a final pathetic display of teenage rebellion. He convinced himself that I had walked out of the house to hide my tears of submission. Preston poured himself another generous measure of bourbon. His hands had stopped shaking. The arrogant smirk crept back onto his pale face. He laughed a dry, mocking laugh and said new money was always so predictable. He boasted that his old money tactics and his legal threats had put me exactly where I belonged. He told Chanel that Vanguard Horizon would be funding their luxury lifestyle by Monday morning. The delusion spread through the room like a comforting disease. They spent the rest of the evening celebrating their imaginary victory. Brenda immediately began redrawing the seating chart for the upcoming Saturday gala. She proudly announced that she would place me at the main table directly to Calvin's right. She wanted the entire congregation and all the wealthy donors to see the disgraced daughter sitting obediently beside the forgiving patriarch. She wanted to parade my submission in front of the local politicians to prove that the family dynasty was completely unified. Chanel wiped her ruined makeup and pulled out her smartphone. She immediately began browsing online boutiques for a new designer gown for the gala. She complained that she needed something spectacular to outshine me when the cameras flashed. She was already spending the grant money in her mind. Over the next 3 days, Calvin and Preston shifted their political machine into overdrive. They hired a premier public relations firm to manage the Saturday night gala. They invited every local news anchor, every political blogger, and every high society photographer in the city of Atlanta. They wanted maximum exposure for my surrender. Calvin spent hours standing alone in the massive sanctuary of his megachurch practicing his keynote speech. He stood behind his polished wooden pulpit while the stained glass windows cast colorful light across the empty pews. He wrote a deeply manipulative sermon about grace and forgiveness. He planned to use my return as the ultimate political launchpad for his city council campaign. He drafted sentences about a lost sheep returning to the fold. He practiced summoning fake tears on command. He planned to tell the audience that his love had cured my mental instability. He was preparing to steal my success and claim it as a miracle of his own making. Preston spent his week playing golf at his exclusive country club. He boasted to the other wealthy executives that he had just secured a massive corporate sponsorship from Vanguard Horizon. He told them he had single-handedly convinced a stubborn billionaire to fund his philanthropic vision. He ignored the eviction notices sitting on his desk. He ignored the panicked emails from his accountants regarding the missing state subsidies. He believed my money would erase his crimes before the auditors ever arrived. He wore his white savior mask with absolute pride, while he drank expensive scotch and laughed at my expense. While they spent their days planning a victory parade, I spent my days in the cold, sterile war room of my corporate headquarters. The sweeping panorama of the Atlanta skyline outside my top-floor window offered no distraction. I sat behind my custom mahogany desk. The surface was no longer clear. It was covered in dozens of black leather folders. These were not grant applications or charity proposals. They were meticulously documented criminal indictments. I was not alone in my office. Two senior federal investigators sat in the leather chairs across from my desk. Special Agent Miller from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Special Agent Hayes from the Internal Revenue Service reviewed the files in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of heavy paper. I did not offer them coffee or small talk. I provided them with undeniable weaponized truth. I slid a thick folder across the desk toward Special Agent Miller. I told him to look at the routing numbers on page 4. I explained exactly how Preston had structured his shell companies. I walked the agent through the digital paper trail that my security team had uncovered. I showed him how Preston was illegally siphoning federal lunch subsidies meant for underprivileged students and funneling the cash directly into private offshore accounts. I provided the bank statements, the forged vendor invoices, and the corresponding dates when Preston paid off his massive casino debts. I handed them the absolute proof that the golden boy of Atlanta society was operating a multi-million-dollar fraud ring out of a taxpayer-funded school building. Special Agent Miller closed the folder and nodded. The evidence was irrefutable. I turned my attention to Special Agent Hayes. I slid a second black folder across the mahogany wood. I told her this file contained the financial anatomy of a corrupt political campaign. I explained how Calvin used his megachurch as a tax-exempt shield to wash dirty money. I showed her the direct wire transfers from Preston's fraudulent shell companies into Calvin's supposedly independent political action committee. I provided the tax returns Calvin had falsified to hide the bribes. I handed over the original church ledgers that proved he had stolen my scholarship money 9 years ago to cover his tracks. I laid out the entire incestuous network of embezzlement, tax evasion, and political corruption that kept my family living in a Buckhead mansion. I sat back in my chair and looked at the two federal agents. I told them I did not want quiet subpoenas or polite administrative inquiries. I demanded that the warrants be executed with maximum public visibility. I told them I wanted the arrests to reflect the magnitude of the crimes committed against the community. The agents packed the heavy black folders into their briefcases. They stood up and thanked me for the unprecedented level of cooperation. They assured me that the warrants would be finalized and signed by a federal judge within 48 hours. They shook my hand and walked out of my office. I turned my leather chair to face the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out over the sprawling city. My reflection stared back at me in the thick glass. The phantom weight of a cheap canvas backpack settled onto my shoulders. $17. One backpack. 9 years. The repetition echoed in my mind like the steady beat of a war drum. It grounded me. It reminded me of the cold nights sleeping on bus station benches. It reminded me of the hunger that kept me awake and the rage that kept me alive. My family thought they could erase that history with a command to kneel. They thought they could silence me with the threat of a boycott. They had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. $17, one backpack, 9 years. The countdown was officially over. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp breeze and a sky full of bright stars. The grounds of the megachurch were completely transformed. Powerful rented spotlights swept across the massive brick facade. A long red carpet stretched from the circular driveway all the way up the grand stone steps to the main entrance. The parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles and sleek black town cars. The local media had arrived in full force just as Calvin had planned. News vans parked along the street with their satellite dishes raised. High society photographers clustered behind velvet ropes holding their cameras ready. Inside the sanctuary, hundreds of wealthy donors, political allies, and church elders mingled under crystal chandeliers. Calvin and Preston stood near the entrance, shaking hands and accepting endless praise. They were dressed in immaculate tuxedos. They smiled brilliantly for the cameras, posing as the ultimate pillars of the community. Brenda and Chanel circulated through the crowd, wearing designer gowns funded by stolen money. They whispered to their wealthy friends that the prodigal daughter was returning tonight. They promised a spectacular show of family unity and corporate generosity. They were completely intoxicated by their own delusions. I sat in the back of my custom armored executive vehicle as it glided through the iron gates of the church property. My private chauffeur navigated the long driveway slowly. I looked out the tinted window at the circus they had created. I did not wear a modest dress to blend in. I did not wear a penitent expression. I wore a sharp, tailored crimson power suit that cut a striking silhouette. I wore diamonds that I bought with my own clean money. I held a sleek black clutch that contained no grant approvals and no corporate shares. My vehicle pulled to a smooth stop at the base of the red carpet. The low hum of the engine signaled my arrival. The crowd of valets and event staff fell silent. The photographers turned their lenses toward the dark-tinted windows. They knew who I was. The business world knew the face of the Vanguard Horizon CEO. The chauffeur stepped out and walked around to my side of the vehicle. He opened the heavy door. I stepped out onto the red carpet. The cool air hit my face. A storm of camera flashes erupted instantly. The rapid clicking of shutters sounded like a swarm of locusts. Reporters leaned over the velvet ropes, calling my name and asking about my unexpected appearance at the gala. They asked if Vanguard Horizon was officially endorsing Calvin's political campaign. They asked if I was partnering with Preston's educational network. I did not ignore them. I did not rush past them with my head down. I stopped directly in the center of the red carpet. I stood tall and squared my shoulders. I looked directly into the blinking lenses of the local news cameras. I let a slow, calm smile touch my lips. I raised my voice just enough to carry over the chaotic noise of the press line. I stated clearly and confidently that they should keep their cameras rolling. I declared that the entire community was about to witness an absolute miracle. I turned away from the press and began my long, deliberate walk up the stone steps. The heavy doors of the church stood open, waiting for my arrival. I could see the soft golden light spilling out from the grand foyer. I could see the silhouettes of my family waiting to receive my submission. $17. One backpack. 9 years. I stepped across the threshold and brought the fire with me. I walked through the massive double doors of the fellowship hall. The space was completely transformed. The church had spared absolutely no expense for this event. Heavy silk drapes hung from the ceiling to the floor. Huge arrangements of white roses and orchids sat on every table. The room was packed with the most influential Black leaders in Atlanta. I saw judges sitting with corporate executives. I saw local politicians shaking hands with wealthy real estate developers. This was Calvin building his political kingdom. He was using the church funds to throw a massive party for the elite. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and roasted meat. The soft glow of the crystal chandeliers illuminated the room. I stood at the entrance in my crimson power suit. I let my eyes sweep over the crowd. This was the audience my family had assembled to witness my surrender. My grandmother, Geraldine, sat in the very front row holding her silver-handled cane. She looked like an ancient queen surveying her conquered territory. My mother, Brenda, materialized from the crowd almost instantly. She wore a heavy beaded gown that dragged on the carpet. Her face was pulled into a tight artificial smile. She linked her arm through mine with a painful grip. Her manicured nails dug into my sleeve. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She leaned close to my ear and told me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. She guided me away from the front of the room. We walked past the tables with the mayors and the city council members. We walked past the tables with the wealthy church elders. We kept walking until we reached the very back of the hall. The lighting was dim here. The table was tucked into a dark corner right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Waiters rushed past us carrying heavy trays of food. Brenda pulled out a small wooden chair and shoved me toward it. She told me to sit and remember my place. She said I would not be allowed to ruin their night with any more corporate delusions. Brenda walked away to resume her role as the perfect pastor wife. Chanel took the empty seat right next to me. She was assigned to be my warden for the evening. She wore a sparkling silver dress that caught the dim light. She crossed her arms and leaned toward me. The smell of her heavy perfume made the air feel stale. Chanel began her psychological warfare immediately. She whispered insults directly into my ear. She told me my crimson suit was a desperate cry for attention. She called me a pathetic fraud playing dress-up with corporate money. She said my little stunt with the federal investigators earlier in the week was a bluff that grandmother Geraldine had easily crushed. She reminded me of the fake mental health records Brenda kept in the bank vault. She told me I was entirely powerless against the combined might of our family. Chanel did not know that the federal agents were currently staging their strike team in the parking lot outside. She thought she was untouchable. I did not turn my head to look at her. I did not offer a single word in response. I sat perfectly still with my back straight against the chair. I placed my black clutch on my lap. I picked up my crystal water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the glass. Chanel continued her vicious whispers. She recounted all the times she had beaten me down when we were children. She said the entire room knew I was mentally unstable. She promised that after tonight I would be completely stripped of my wealth and forced to scrub the church floors for minimum wage. Her voice was trembling with a frantic, nervous energy. She needed me to react. She needed me to show fear. I simply smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. I looked straight ahead at the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. I took another sip of my ice water. My absolute silence was driving her insane. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The dull roar of conversation in the hall slowly died down. The overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow. A bright white spotlight hit the center of the large stage. My father Calvin walked out from behind the velvet curtain. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. He waved his hands and smiled his signature brilliant smile. He walked up to the polished wooden podium. He adjusted the microphone with practiced ease. He looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. He took a deep breath and began his performance. His voice boomed through the massive speakers. He thanked the politicians and the donors for their generous support of his city council campaign. He spoke about the power of community and the sacred duty of lifting up the less fortunate. Every word he spoke was a calculated political maneuver. He was feeding them the exact narrative they paid to hear. He was a master manipulator working his favorite crowd. Calvin shifted his speech to the topic of education. He pointed a dramatic finger toward the front row. The spotlight shifted to illuminate Preston. My white brother-in-law stood up and buttoned his expensive tuxedo jacket. He turned and waved to the clapping crowd. He wore the flawless smile of a generous philanthropist. Calvin spoke about Preston with intense reverence. He called him a visionary leader who was single-handedly saving the underprivileged youth of Atlanta. He praised the charter school network. He completely ignored the fact that Preston was 6 months behind on rent and stealing lunch money to pay casino debts. He painted Preston as a saint walking among mortals. Preston soaked up the adoration. He bowed his head in fake humility. He played his part perfectly. He truly believed his old money heritage and his law degree made him invincible against my real estate claims. He sat back down to another round of massive applause. Calvin returned his focus to the center of the room. The tone of his voice grew soft and emotional. He gripped the edges of the podium. He told the crowd that true leadership required immense personal sacrifice. He said the greatest test of a man was his ability to forgive those who had caused him profound pain. He transitioned smoothly into the story of his prodigal daughter. He recounted the tragic tale of my supposed mental breakdown 9 years ago. He spoke about the dark days when I was lost to the streets. He said he had prayed every single night for my safe return. He wiped a single manufactured tear from his cheek. The audience was completely captivated. Women in the front row were dabbing their eyes. Calvin proclaimed that the power of family grace had finally healed my broken mind. He announced that I had returned to the fold to seek redemption. He was setting the stage for the ultimate display of his power over me. Calvin raised his hand and pointed directly to the dark back corner of the room where I was sitting. The bright white spotlight swung across the ceiling and locked onto my table. Hundreds of heads turned to stare at me. The silence in the room was absolute. Calvin spoke into the microphone. He called my name. He asked his beautiful, healed daughter to join him on the stage. Chanel nudged my arm and whispered that it was time to surrender. I stood up slowly. I picked up my black clutch. I smoothed the front of my crimson suit. I stepped out from behind the table. I began the long walk down the center aisle. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. I felt the heavy gaze of judges and politicians. I felt the arrogant stares of my mother and grandmother. $17. One backpack. 9 years. The repetition pulsed in my mind with every step I took on the thick carpet. The walk felt like an eternity. The silence was deafening. I passed the tables filled with wealthy donors. I passed the community leaders who thought they were witnessing a touching family reunion. I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not look at the ground. I kept my eyes locked on Calvin waiting at the podium. I reached the front of the hall. I climbed the 5 carpeted steps leading up to the main stage. I walked across the wooden floorboards. I stood directly beside my father. The bright heat of the spotlight washed over me. Preston stood up from his front row seat and walked up the stairs to join us. He stood on my other side. They were flanking me like prison guards. They wanted to trap me in front of the entire city. They wanted to make sure I could not escape my public humiliation. Grandmother Geraldine watched from her front row seat with a smug, satisfied grin on her wrinkled face. Calvin reached inside his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a thick document bound in a blue leather cover. He laid it flat on the wooden podium for everyone to see. I recognized the paperwork immediately. It was the asset transfer agreement that Grandmother Geraldine had demanded. It was the legal mechanism designed to strip me of my $50 million educational fund and hand the entire corporation over to Calvin and Preston. Calvin leaned close to the microphone. He spoke with a voice dripping in fake emotion. He told the crowd that my miraculous recovery had inspired me to make a monumental gesture of faith. He announced that I was legally transferring the Vanguard Horizon corporate portfolio to the church and the charter school network. He said this massive donation would secure the future of the community forever. The crowd let out a collective gasp of pure shock. They started to clap and cheer loudly. They thought they were witnessing the greatest philanthropic donation in the history of the city. Calvin waited for the applause to die down. He reached into his pocket again. He pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He turned to me with a victor smile. He held the pen out for me to take. He pointed a manicured finger at the bottom of the asset transfer agreement. Preston leaned in close and whispered that I needed to sign on the dotted line if I wanted to survive the night. He reminded me of his legal threats. He reminded me of my mother's blackmail. They thought they had backed me into a corner with no exit. They thought the pressure of hundreds of watching eyes would force my hand. They assumed the broken girl from 9 years ago was finally going to surrender her life to the dynasty. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at Calvin. I looked at Preston. I looked out at the massive sea of influential faces waiting for me to break. I raised my hand. I did not reach for the heavy gold fountain pen that Calvin was offering me. I raised my hand toward the back of the massive sanctuary. I pointed 2 fingers directly at the elevated tech booth where the church audio and visual team operated the massive digital screens. Calvin looked confused. He pushed the gold pen closer to my chest. He whispered through his gritted teeth and told me to stop playing games and sign the transfer agreement. I ignored him completely. I stepped away from the wooden podium and walked right up to the edge of the stage. The bright spotlight followed my crimson suit. I stared directly down at the front row, where Geraldine and Brenda were sitting. I looked at Preston, who was standing just a few feet away from me. The arrogant smile on his face began to falter. He could sense that the script had changed. He could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting from celebration to confusion. I lowered my hand. The tech booth received my signal. My personal security chief had quietly relieved the church staff of their duties 10 minutes ago. He was now sitting at the control board. The soft gospel music playing over the speakers abruptly cut off. The giant digital screens hanging on the walls behind the stage flickered and went entirely black. A low hum of static echoed through the vast hall. Hundreds of influential donors and politicians murmured in the darkness. Calvin tapped the microphone and awkwardly apologized for the technical difficulty. He tried to laugh it off as a minor glitch. He had no idea the blackout was fully intentional. Suddenly, the massive screens flashed brilliantly back to life. They did not display the church logo or Calvin's campaign slogan. They displayed a series of highly detailed corporate banking ledgers. The documents were magnified so large that every single person in the back row could read the routing numbers. The room fell absolutely dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. I stepped back to the podium. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and pulled the microphone directly out of Calvin's hand. I turned to face the audience of Atlanta's elite. I kept my voice perfectly level and projected it across the silent hall. I told them they were looking at the internal financial records of the Vanguard Horizon Charter School network. I pointed to the glowing screens behind me. I instructed the city council members and the wealthy donors to pay very close attention to the highlighted columns. I explained that the numbers on the left represented federal grants and state subsidies. These were millions of taxpayer dollars explicitly meant to provide free lunches, new textbooks, and safe transportation for underprivileged Black children in the city. I paused to let the weight of that statement settle over the crowd. I turned my head and looked right at Preston. The color had drained completely from his face. He looked like a ghost standing in a tailored tuxedo. He took a step backward as if he wanted to run away from the stage. I turned back to the crowd and pointed to the highlighted columns on the right side of the screen. I explained that those numbers represented where the money actually went. The digital display shifted to a new set of documents. It showed a web of private offshore accounts and luxury retail receipts. I read the transactions out loud into the microphone. I listed a wire transfer for $80,000 to a high-end European car dealership. I listed a payment of $120,000 to a luxury real estate broker in Buckhead. I listed dozens of individual transactions ranging from $10,000 to $50,000, each going directly to designer boutiques in Paris and Milan. I announced clearly that every single cent of that money had been funneled directly into personal bank accounts owned by Chanel. A loud gasp rippled through the audience. Heads whipped around to look at Chanel, where she sat frozen at her table in the back of the room. The spotlight suddenly swung away from the stage and pinned her in a blinding circle of white light. Her silver dress sparkled as the crowd stared at her in sheer horror. She tried to cover her face with her hands, but the cameras were already flashing. The high society photographers who had been hired to capture my surrender were now eagerly documenting her exposure. I did not stop there. I pressed my advantage. I told the crowd that Preston and Chanel had built their entire luxury lifestyle by stealing food from the mouths of hungry children. I said they used the charter school as a personal piggy bank, while the actual classrooms suffered from leaking roofs and outdated supplies. I told the donors that the charitable donations they had made to Preston's educational fund over the past 4 years had been used to buy Chanel's diamond necklaces and Preston's country club memberships. I laid their utter corruption bare for the entire city to see. Calvin tried to intervene. He grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away from the podium. His face was twisted in sheer panic. He knew his political career was evaporating in front of his eyes. He hissed at me to stop this insanity before I destroyed the entire family. I shoved his hand away with brutal force. I leaned into the microphone and told the congregation that their beloved pastor was fully aware of the embezzlement. I declared that Calvin had actively helped launder the stolen money through the church tax-exempt accounts to fund his own city council campaign. The fellowship hall erupted into absolute chaos. Donors were standing up and shouting. City politicians were frantically texting their public relations managers trying to distance themselves from Calvin and Preston. Church elders were demanding answers. The pristine illusion of the family dynasty was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Preston finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged across the stage and violently snatched the microphone out of my hand. The speakers shrieked with a loud burst of feedback. Preston was sweating profusely. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium and screamed into the microphone. He yelled that the documents on the screens were entirely fake. He pointed a trembling finger at me and told the crowd I was a pathological liar. He claimed I had hired digital hackers to fabricate the bank statements because I was insanely jealous of his success. He said my history of mental illness was well documented, and I was clearly having a psychotic break in front of them all. He turned to the sides of the hall and began screaming for the church security guards. He ordered them to get on the stage and throw me out of the building. He yelled that I was trespassing and disturbing a private religious event. He demanded that they shut down the digital screens immediately and physically remove me from the premises. He was hyperventilating and losing his grip on reality. He thought he could just shout loud enough and the truth would simply disappear. Two burly security guards in dark suits began pushing their way through the chaotic crowd toward the front stairs. They looked hesitant. They were church employees who knew who I was. They knew I owned the mortgage on the building, but they were still used to taking orders from Calvin and Preston. They reached the bottom of the stage steps and started to climb up toward me. I did not back away. I did not flinch. I let Preston scream his desperate lies into the microphone. I reached down into the pocket of my crimson suit jacket. My fingers closed around a small, cold object. I pulled out a second silver flash drive. I held it up high in the air so the bright spotlight caught the reflection of the metal. I turned to look at Calvin and Preston. Their eyes locked onto the small device in my hand. I did not need the microphone to make them hear me. I stepped closer to them and lowered my voice so only they could hear the promise of their absolute destruction. I told them the first presentation was just the financial records. I said this second drive contained the audio recordings. I told them my security team had tapped the phones in the mansion 3 days ago. I stated that I had crystal-clear audio files of Calvin and Preston explicitly discussing how to launder the stolen charter school money. I said I had recordings of Geraldine threatening to ruin my company if I did not submit to her extortion. I had them all confessing to their crimes in their own arrogant voices. I looked at the security guards, who were now standing just a few feet away from me. I held the flash drive out toward them. I asked them very calmly if they truly wanted to lay hands on a woman who was about to hand over federal evidence of grand larceny to the authorities. The guards stopped dead in their tracks. They looked at Preston's panicked face and then looked back at the flash drive in my hand. They slowly backed away and retreated down the stairs. They were not going to risk going to federal prison for a corrupt pastor and a fraudulent son-in-law. The power dynamic on the stage flipped entirely. Preston dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden floorboards with a loud thud that echoed through the massive speakers. He staggered backward and bumped into the velvet curtain. He realized there was no escape. The documents could be denied, but his own voice recording could not. Calvin sank down into one of the chairs on the stage and put his head between his knees. His political dreams were dead. His reputation was incinerated. The entire room of wealthy elites was turning against them. I stood alone at the center of the stage. The crimson suit I wore felt like armor. I looked down at the front row where Geraldine was sitting. The mighty matriarch was completely silent. She was gripping her silver-handled cane with trembling hands. Her dark eyes were wide with genuine terror. She had finally realized that she was not the most powerful person in the room. She had finally realized that the girl she had thrown onto the street 9 years ago had returned as a force of nature she could not control. I had not just flipped the table. I had broken the entire foundation of their corrupt empire. The flashing cameras and the shouting crowd faded into the background. I stood in the bright white spotlight and allowed myself to feel the victory. The mask was completely destroyed, and there was nothing left but the truth. I lowered my hand and gave a sharp nod to the tech booth at the very back of the room. My security chief did not hesitate for a second. He bypassed the audio files entirely and brought up the next sequence of visual evidence. The massive digital screens behind me flickered violently. The offshore bank accounts and designer retail receipts vanished from view. They were instantly replaced by a series of highly classified internal church documents. The sanctuary was already buzzing with angry whispers from Preston's exposure, but when the new documents appeared, a completely different kind of shockwave rolled through the massive crowd. These were not corporate ledgers from Vanguard Horizon. These were not charter school invoices. These were the sacred financial records of the church itself. I stepped back up to the wooden podium. I did not need to snatch the microphone this time because Preston had dropped it on the floor when he panicked. I picked the microphone up and dusted it off. I looked out at the faces of the church elders, the senior congregants, and the loyal members who had given their hard-earned money to this ministry. I told them to look very closely at the bottom right corner of the projected documents. I pointed to the massive bold signature written in thick black ink. It was Calvin's unmistakable handwriting authorizing the massive withdrawals. I kept my voice perfectly steady and clear. I explained that when Preston began losing his state subsidies due to his excessive gambling debts, his entire charter school network was on the verge of total bankruptcy. I told the crowd that Preston went to his father-in-law for a quiet, massive bailout to save his fragile white savior image. I stated that Calvin did not use his own personal wealth to save Preston. I declared that my father used the keys to the kingdom. I walked the audience through the specific dates and the massive transfer amounts displayed on the bright screens. I showed them exactly how Calvin had systematically drained the church retirement fund. I explained that the pensions of the elderly choir members, the savings of the dedicated deacons, and the future financial security of the entire pastoral staff had been completely wiped out. I told the congregation that their trusted spiritual leader had taken their life savings and pumped millions of dollars directly into Preston's failing shell companies just to keep the family name out of the local tabloids. The reaction was immediate and absolutely catastrophic. The polite, wealthy decorum of the high society gala shattered into a million pieces. An elderly deacon in the third row stood up and threw his silk napkin furiously onto the floor. He yelled that he had trusted Calvin with his family's future for 30 years, and now he had nothing left. A prominent city councilwoman who had just endorsed Calvin's political campaign began shouting at her aides to get her out of the building immediately. The outrage erupted across the hall like a violent, unpredictable storm. Men and women who had revered my father as an untouchable pillar of the black community were now surging forward and screaming for his head. They realized their holy shepherd was nothing but a common thief who had sacrificed their financial security to buy his favorite daughter a wealthy white husband. Calvin stood frozen on the stage right beside me. The color drained from his face until he looked like pale, wet ash. His tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. He opened his mouth to speak to offer some sort of pastoral reassurance, but the deafening roar of the betrayed congregation entirely drowned out his voice. Down in the front row, my grandmother Geraldine finally realized her entire carefully constructed empire was collapsing. The untouchable matriarch panicked. She stood up on her trembling legs and raised her silver-handled cane high into the air. She brought the heavy wood down hard against the edge of the formal dining table. She banged the cane repeatedly, trying to command absolute silence, just as she had done for decades. She yelled at the church elders to sit down and remember who built this congregation. She commanded the local politicians to show some respect for the house of God. Nobody listened to her. The loud, sharp cracks of her cane were completely swallowed by the furious shouts of the angry crowd. The people she had manipulated and controlled from the shadows no longer feared her. They were too angry about their stolen pensions to care about her ancient social authority. Geraldine kept banging her cane until her frail arms finally gave out. She slumped back into her velvet chair, gasping for air. The architect of the dynasty was finally utterly powerless. My mother Brenda stood a few feet away from Geraldine. Her heavy beaded gown glittered under the chaotic strobe of media camera flashes. She looked around the room at the angry, disgusted faces of the wealthy donors she had spent her entire life trying to impress. She saw her exclusive country club friends pulling away from her in absolute horror. She saw the local news media recording every single second of their public downfall. The sheer magnitude of her social destruction hit her all at once. The reality that she would never again host a prestigious charity dinner or sit at the head table overwhelmed her fragile nervous system. Brenda let out a high-pitched, terrible gasp. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor. She fainted dead away, right in front of the flashing cameras. Chanel was no longer acting like the superior golden child. The vicious sister who had whispered cruel insults into my ear just an hour ago was now completely terrified. She had scrambled away from our table when the crowd first started shouting. She was currently cowering in a dark corner near the swinging catering doors. She had her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, pulling her sparkling silver dress closely around her shaking body. She was sobbing hysterically. The designer bags and the luxury mansion she loved so much were built on stolen pensions and federal fraud. She knew the federal agents would be seizing her bank accounts by morning. She was stripped bare of her purchased privilege. The stage felt like a quiet island in the middle of a raging, violent ocean. Calvin finally moved. He realized he could not control the massive crowd, so he turned all his venom entirely on me. His chest heaved with heavy, panicked breaths. He pointed a long, trembling finger directly at my face. The mask of the loving, forgiving father was entirely gone. His eyes burned with a dark, violent hatred that he could no longer hide. He roared over the deafening noise of the crowd. He called me a wretched, ungrateful abomination. He screamed that I was a curse upon his bloodline and a cancer to this family. He yelled that I had always been a poison in his house since the day I was born. He blamed me entirely for the destruction of the church. He blamed me for ruining his pristine political career. He cursed my name and told me I would burn in hell for disrespecting my parents and destroying the holy sanctuary he had built with his own 2 hands. He spit the words at me, trying to use his religious authority to make me feel small and terrified. I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had stolen my teaching scholarship and thrown me onto the cold street with exactly $17 to my name. I looked at the man who had let me sleep on a wooden bus station bench while he bought his favorite daughter a seat in high society. I looked at the man who used my pain to build his own wealth. His curses meant absolutely nothing to me now. They were just the empty, pathetic words of a broken and desperate criminal facing his own ruin. $17, 1 backpack, 9 years. The rhythm of my survival beat steadily in my chest. I reached into the pocket of my crimson suit jacket one last time. I did not pull out another silver flash drive. I pulled out my personal secure mobile device. I held the phone in my hand and looked Calvin dead in the eyes. I gave him one final cold and unyielding smile. I pressed a single button on the smooth glass screen and sent a prearranged encrypted text message to Special Agent Miller. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I stood perfectly still on the wooden stage and waited. It only took 10 seconds. The sound started as a faint, distant wail in the dark city. It grew louder and more piercing with every passing second. The high-pitched shriek of heavy police sirens cut through the cool night air and pierced the thick walls of the sanctuary. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect through the massive stained glass windows, casting chaotic colored shadows across the panicked crowd. The furious shouting in the fellowship hall slowly died down as the congregants finally realized what the loud sirens meant. The wailing sound multiplied rapidly. There was not just one police cruiser pulling up the long church driveway. There were dozens of them. Heavy armored federal vehicles and local police units were surrounding the entire church property. The sirens screamed from every possible direction, locking the building down completely. The flashing emergency lights illuminated Calvin's terrified frozen face in alternating shades of stark red and cold blue. The stage was set, and the final act had officially arrived. The heavy oak doors at the back of the fellowship hall burst open with a deafening crash. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with federal agency letters printed in bright yellow across their backs swarmed into the room. Local police officers in tactical gear flanked them, blocking every possible exit. I had not just triggered this spectacle tonight on a whim. I had walked into the Federal Bureau of Investigation downtown at 8 in the morning. I had handed over the hard drives, the bank routing numbers, the audio files, and the complete blueprint of their criminal enterprise. The agents had spent the entire day securing warrants and quietly positioning their strike teams. They were just waiting for my signal to drop the net. Preston realized the gravity of the situation immediately. The arrogant sneer on his face morphed into pure cowardice in a fraction of a second. He shoved his way past Calvin and sprinted toward the back stairs of the stage. He thought his generational wealth and his country club connections could somehow grant him an invisible exit from this nightmare. He hit the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, expecting to find an empty alleyway where he could slip into the night. Instead, he crashed chest first into 3 heavily armed tactical officers who had already secured the perimeter. They grabbed Preston by the collar of his expensive tuxedo jacket and threw him violently to the floor. His pristine white shirt was pressed hard against the carpet as the cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. They hauled him back out into the main fellowship hall. The white supremacist who had spent his entire life secretly looking down on the black community was now paraded in chains in front of hundreds of the very people he despised. He was whining and crying. He demanded to call his father. He sobbed that he was a victim of a targeted setup and that he did not know anything about the stolen funds. The wealthy black executives and local politicians watched him with absolute disgust. His facade of superiority was entirely gone, leaving nothing but a pathetic, weeping thief. The lead federal agents marched straight down the center aisle. The sea of angry congregants parted to let them through. The agents climbed the steps to the main stage with heavy, deliberate footsteps. Calvin backed away from them until his shoulders hit the dark digital screen. His hands were raised in a trembling gesture of surrender. He looked at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows. He looked at his congregation shouting for his immediate arrest. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes were wide and frantic. The proud, arrogant pastor was completely broken. His knees gave out and he collapsed onto the wooden floorboards. He reached his hands out toward my crimson suit. He begged me to tell the agents it was all a misunderstanding. He begged me to use my corporate lawyers to stop the arrest. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He called me his daughter. He said the word daughter with so much manufactured affection and desperate longing. It was the very first time in 9 long years that he had claimed me as his own flesh and blood. He thought the biological title would act as a magic spell to save him from federal prison. He thought playing the role of a loving father could erase a decade of cruelty in a matter of seconds. I looked down at the man kneeling in front of me. I looked at the sweat ruining his expensive clerical collar. I looked at the absolute terror drowning his eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for him. There was no pity and there was no anger left. There was just the cold, flat emptiness of justice finally being served. $17. 1 backpack. 9 years. The repetition echoed in my mind as I stared at his trembling hands. I leaned down slightly so he could hear my voice clearly over the chaotic noise of the room. I did not yell or scream. I spoke to him with a perfectly calm and level tone. I looked deep into his desperate, tear-filled eyes, and I repeated the exact words he had spoken to me on that freezing driveway 9 years ago. I told him that the mentally unstable have no place in this family. Calvin let out a hollow, devastated sob. The breath completely left his lungs. He knew it was over. He knew the girl he had thrown away had returned to burn his kingdom to the ground. The federal agents grabbed his arms and hoisted him roughly to his feet. They pulled his hands behind his back and fastened the heavy metal cuffs around his wrists. They read him his rights as they marched him across his own stage and down the carpeted stairs. Geraldine sat frozen in the front row. She was completely paralyzed watching her golden son being hauled away like a common criminal. She could not bang her cane. She could not issue a single command. She was just a frail old woman watching the end of her legacy. Brenda was still unconscious on the floor, entirely ignorant to the final moments of her high society life. Chanel was sobbing hysterically in the corner, surrounded by police officers who were demanding her identification and seizing her designer purse. I stood alone at the podium. The bright spotlight was still shining down on me. I watched the police officers escort my father out the double doors and into the flashing lights of the night. The fellowship hall was buzzing with the frantic energy of a fallen dynasty. The people who had come to witness my surrender were now the primary witnesses to my absolute victory. I picked up my black clutch from the wooden podium. I smoothed the front of my crimson suit. I walked down the stairs of the stage and walked straight out the front doors. The cool night air washed over my face. The sirens continued to wail in the distance. I walked past the fleet of police cruisers and stepped into the back of my waiting town car. The driver shut the door behind me, sealing out the noise and the flashing lights. I leaned my head back against the leather seat and told the driver to take me home. I told the driver to stop the car. My hand rested on the cool leather of the door handle. I looked out the tinted window at the massive brick structure of the church. The federal agents had already hauled Calvin and Preston away in the back of their armored vehicles. The wealthy donors and the corrupt politicians had scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship. But the night was not quite over. There was one final piece of business I needed to finish before I could truly leave this place behind forever. I picked up the old, faded backpack sitting on the seat next to me. It was the exact same backpack I had carried 9 years ago when they threw me onto the street. It held the physical reminder of everything I had survived and everything I had overcome. I opened the car door and stepped back out into the cool night air. I told the driver to wait right there by the curb. I walked back through the heavy wooden doors of the fellowship hall. The silence inside the massive room was deafening. Just an hour ago, this space was filled with the elite members of Atlanta society, laughing and drinking expensive champagne and making corrupt deals. Now it looked like the devastating aftermath of a natural disaster. The crystal chandeliers still cast a soft glow over the overturned chairs and the discarded silk napkins. The extravagant arrangements of white roses were crushed and trampled into the carpet by the stampede of panicked guests. Champagne glasses were shattered on the floor, reflecting the dim light in 1,000 broken pieces. The illusion of the family dynasty had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the ugly, undeniable truth behind. Standing in the center of the ruined room were the 3 women who had orchestrated every single day of my misery. Geraldine, Brenda, and Chanel. They were the only ones left. Everyone else had abandoned them the absolute second the money dried up and the federal agents arrived. I walked slowly down the center aisle. My footsteps echoed steadily in the vast empty space. Brenda was sitting on the edge of the carpeted stage stairs. Her heavy beaded gown was torn at the hem and covered in spilled red wine. Her perfect makeup was completely smeared down her face from crying. She looked like a hollow, trembling ghost of the arrogant pastor wife she used to be. She was staring blankly at the floor, completely unable to process the total collapse of her social standing. Chanel was standing near one of the empty catering tables. She was frantically scrolling through her phone. Her hands were shaking violently as she tapped the screen over and over again. She was muttering to herself that her platinum credit cards were declining. She tried to call her private wealth manager, but the calls went straight to voicemail. The federal government had already frozen every single one of their offshore accounts. Their luxury vehicles were currently being impounded. The sprawling mansions they lived in were now active crime scenes sealed off with yellow tape. Their husbands were sitting in federal holding cells and their high society reputations were permanently decimated. They had absolutely nothing left to their names. Geraldine was still sitting in her front row seat. She leaned heavily on her silver-handled cane. She looked up as I approached. She tried to compose her wrinkled face into that familiar mask of supreme, unyielding authority. She tried to straighten her posture and look down her nose at me, just like she had done my entire life. She refused to accept that her power was gone. She tapped her cane against the floor. The sound was weak and pathetic in the massive empty hall, but she still expected everyone to snap to attention. She looked at me and demanded that I call my corporate lawyers immediately. Her voice was shaking, but she still tried to sound like a queen issuing an order to a peasant. She told me I needed to wire $2 million to the federal courthouse right this second to pay the bail for Calvin and Preston. She said I owed it to the family name to fix this horrific mess. She told me I had made my point and thrown my little tantrum, but now it was time to clean up the destruction and protect the dynasty from the media. She actually believed she could still control me. She actually thought the invisible chains of family obligations still held me down. She thought I was still the scared little girl desperate for her approval and terrified of her wrath. I stood a few feet away from them. I looked at my mother who would not even meet my eyes. I looked at my sister whose entire identity was tied to the stolen designer clothes she was wearing. I looked at the matriarch who had built an empire on lies and manipulation and greed. I did not feel an ounce of anger anymore. I did not feel any sadness or regret or vindictiveness. I just felt a profound, deep sense of clarity. The psychological hold they once had over my mind was completely broken. They were no longer the giants who haunted my nightmares. They were just three pathetic women who had traded their souls for money and power and ended up with nothing. I told Geraldine I would not be calling any lawyers. I told her I would not be wiring a single cent to the federal courthouse to save her corrupt son and her supremacist grandson-in-law. I explained that Vanguard Horizon was now under the protection of a new independent financial trust, and every remaining dollar would go directly back to the underprivileged children of Atlanta where it belonged. I said the church accounts were empty, and their personal wealth was seized as evidence of federal fraud. I told them the era of the family dynasty was officially dead and buried, and no amount of demanding or threatening was going to bring it back to life. Chanel dropped her phone on the floor. The screen shattered against the wood, but she did not even notice. She started screaming at me. Her voice echoed wildly through the empty hall. She asked how she was supposed to survive without her money. She asked where she was supposed to live now that the federal agents were seizing her mansion in Buckhead. She cried that she did not know how to do anything else and that she could not be poor. Brenda finally looked up from the floor and begged me to help them. The arrogant woman who had ignored my suffering for years was now pleading for my mercy. She cried that they were my family and I could not just leave them out on the street with nothing. She said they would have no food and no place to go and no one left in the world to support them. I did not answer her with words. I swung my old faded backpack off my shoulder. I unzipped the main compartment. I reached my hand deep inside and pulled out a small stack of crumpled faded paper money. It was exactly 17 $1 bills. I had kept them safe for 9 long years. It was the exact amount of money they had allowed me to keep when they kicked me out of the house and abandoned me to the unforgiving streets. I held the crumpled bills in my hand. I looked at the three women who had tried to break my spirit and crush my future. They stared at the money in my hand with wide, desperate eyes. I opened my hand and let the money fall. The 17 $1 bills fluttered slowly through the air. They drifted down like dead leaves and landed silently on the thick, expensive carpet right at Geraldine's feet. I told them they could use that money to start their new lives. I said it was more than enough to survive if they worked hard enough and stayed focused. I told them to keep their heads down and remember their place. I fed their exact cruel words right back to them and watched the realization wash over their faces. I did not wait for their reaction. I turned my back on them. I heard Chanel sob loudly, and I heard Geraldine gasp, but I did not look back as I walked away. I left them standing in the ruins of their own greed, staring at the $17 scattered on the floor. I walked up the center aisle and pushed open the massive double doors of the fellowship hall for the very last time. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me with a solid final thud that echoed deep in my chest. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the front steps of the church. The police cruisers were entirely gone. The flashing emergency lights had disappeared down the street, taking the last remnants of my toxic past with them. The parking lot was quiet and peaceful and empty, except for my waiting town car. I took a deep, long breath of the fresh Atlanta air. My lungs expanded and my chest felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating burdens of family expectation and manipulation were completely gone. The fake religious guilt and the corporate blackmail had evaporated into the dark night. There was no one left to please and no one left to fear. I owned my company. I owned my wealth. I owned my own destiny. I walked down the concrete steps and approached the town car. The driver was standing by the back door, holding it open for me. I smiled at him and slid into the comfortable leather seat. I placed my empty, faded backpack on the seat beside me. I told the driver he could take me home now. The powerful engine purred to life. The car pulled away from the curb and glided smoothly out of the heavy iron church gates. I looked out the tinted window as the massive dark structure of the fellowship hall faded into the distance, shrinking until it was nothing but a tiny shadow in the rearview mirror. The car accelerated down the highway, merging into the bright, speeding lights of the city. I left the darkness behind me forever and drove straight into the beautiful, brilliant future I had built with my own two hands. The most profound lesson from this story is that biological ties do not guarantee unconditional love, loyalty, or respect. For years, a toxic family weaponized vulnerabilities using manipulation and deceit to maintain a fragile empire built on greed. However, this narrative teaches us that true power never comes from seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you. True empowerment is found in radical independence, gathering undeniable truth and finding the quiet strength to walk away. Sometimes the ultimate justice is not about vengeance, but simply exposing the facts and letting corruption orchestrate its own inevitable downfall. Share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of resilience and reclaiming your life.